Have you ever noticed how the most powerful people rarely need to speak to demonstrate their authority, while the insecure talk louder and louder, desperate to prove their worth? Alexander stood at the edge of the conference room, watching as his colleagues frantically pitched their ideas. Their voices grew increasingly strained, each trying to outshine the other with clever arguments and impressive vocabulary. But Alexander remained silent, his piercing gaze methodically scanning the room. At 37 years old, with a hint of grey at his temples and a tailored black suit that contrasted sharply with his pale complexion, he embodied what Nietzsche once called the stillness at the center of chaos. What his colleagues didn't realize was that in his calculated silence, Alexander had already won the battle without uttering a single word. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche understood something profound about human interaction that most of us overlook. True power often manifests in silence rather than speech. In his work Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche wrote, "All truly great thoughts are conceived while walking." This wasn't merely about physical movement, but about the silent contemplation that precedes meaningful expression. For Nietzsche, constant chatter represented weakness, an inability to endure the weight of one's own thoughts. Alexander hadn't always possessed this quiet strength. For years, he suffered from what psychologists now call explanation anxiety, the compulsive need to justify himself, to fill every silence with words. He would leave meetings exhausted, having talked himself into corners while watching others silently claim the intellectual high ground. His breaking point came during a presentation, when his supervisor interrupted him with a simple question that left him stammering. The embarrassment burned through him like acid, but it also awakened something, a realization that would transform his understanding of power dynamics forever. That evening, Alexander pulled out his worn copy of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra and found the passage that would change everything. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. Alexander realized that his endless explanations were attempts to control external chaos when he should have been embracing the chaos within. His journey into strategic silence had begun. The science behind Nietzsche's intuition is surprisingly robust. A study from Harvard Business School discovered that people who speak less in high-stakes negotiations often secure better outcomes. The researchers found that silence creates a vacuum that others feel compelled to fill, usually by revealing more information than they intended. This psychological phenomenon, known as disclosure reciprocity, turns silence into a strategic advantage. By saying less, you learn more. Alexander began to practice what Nietzsche would call the revaluation of values. Instead of seeing silence as emptiness to be filled, he reconceptualized it as a presence to be wielded. He developed 3 silent strategies straight from Nietzschean philosophy. First, the eternal return, a concept suggesting we should live as if we would relive each moment infinitely. Alexander applied this by asking himself before speaking, "Would I want to repeat this statement for eternity?" This simple question eliminated 90% of his unnecessary commentary. Second, he embraced amor fati, the love of fate. In meetings, when others spoke over him or dismissed his ideas, rather than fighting for airtime, he accepted these moments as necessary components of a greater strategy. His colleague Thomas might win the small battle of words, but Alexander was playing a longer game. Third, he cultivated what Nietzsche called the pathos of distance, the ability to emotionally detach from immediate situations to maintain perspective. While his co-workers became emotionally entangled in petty office politics, Alexander's emotional detachment allowed him to see the hidden power dynamics that others missed. The transformation wasn't immediate. For 6 weeks, Alexander practiced conscious silence, often holding his tongue when every instinct screamed for him to speak. He observed how others rushed to fill these gaps with nervous chatter, often contradicting themselves or revealing insecurities. In these moments, Alexander would simply nod slightly, maintaining unwavering eye contact. This minimal acknowledgement became his signature, a gesture that others found simultaneously comforting and unnerving. A curious shift began to occur in the office dynamics. People started approaching Alexander differently, seeking his approval, watching for his reactions. Without saying a word, he had altered how others perceived him. His opinions, offered rarely and precisely, carried more weight precisely because of their scarcity. As Nietzsche wrote, "The less a person speaks, the more they are thought to contain." In one pivotal meeting, the company's director asked each team member to present their proposal for an upcoming project. When Alexander's turn came, instead of launching into an elaborate presentation like his peers, he simply placed 3 meticulously prepared pages on the table and said, "This is what will work. Everything else is unnecessary complication." The room fell silent. The director picked up the papers, studied them carefully, and then looked up at Alexander with newfound respect. "This is exactly what we need," he said. Later that week, Alexander's approach was adopted as the company's strategy, while the verbose presentations of his colleagues were politely filed away. The philosophical underpinnings of Alexander's transformation went beyond mere social strategy. What he was practicing was a modern application of Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, or Superman, one who transcends conventional thinking to create their own values. While others around him remained trapped in what Nietzsche called herd mentality, Alexander had begun to operate above these social constraints, crafting his own rulebook for engagement. His notebook became filled with observations. He documented how his colleague Emma would rush to fill any silence with nervous laughter and self-deprecation, how the department head would make increasingly bold claims when met with silence rather than immediate agreement, how the new intern, despite brilliant ideas, undermined himself by constantly seeking validation after each statement. Alexander wasn't just observing behaviors. He was mapping the insecurities that drove them. One afternoon, during a particularly tense budget meeting, Alexander witnessed the full power of his new approach. The company's financial officer, a man known for his intimidating verbal barrages, was systematically dismantling each department's funding requests. When he turned his attention to Alexander's proposal, everyone braced for the typical confrontation. But instead of defending his numbers with desperate explanations, Alexander simply maintained eye contact, his expression neither defensive nor aggressive, just patiently attentive. The financial officer spoke for nearly 3 minutes, his criticisms growing increasingly strained as Alexander's silence persisted. Then, something remarkable happened. The man began to backtrack, moderating, his own criticism eventually concluding with, "But the core concept has merit. Let's revisit these numbers next week." Without saying a word, Alexander had shifted the entire dynamic. It was as if the financial officer had engaged in a debate with himself and lost. A psychologist might explain this phenomenon through what's called attribution theory, our tendency to assign explanations to others' behaviors. When faced with confidence-inducing silence, people often attribute positive qualities to the silent individual, filling the void with their own positive projections. In Alexander's case, his silence was being interpreted as supreme confidence, deep wisdom, or strategic restraint, depending on who was doing the projecting. But Nietzsche would see something more fundamental happening. In his work, The Gay Science, he wrote about the power of self-mastery. He who cannot obey himself will be commanded. Alexander's colleagues were constantly commanded by their impulses to speak, to explain, to justify, while he had achieved mastery over these same impulses. This self-discipline radiated outward as a form of power that others could sense, but couldn't quite articulate. The changes in Alexander's professional life began to spill into his personal relationships as well. At dinner with friends, he found himself speaking less, but being heard more. His girlfriend commented that conversations with him felt more meaningful, though she couldn't explain exactly why. What she didn't realize was that Alexander had begun applying another Nietzschean principle, that of active listening rather than reactive speaking. When he did choose to break his silence, Alexander employed what rhetoricians call the power of the pregnant pause. Before making important points, he would pause deliberately, creating a moment of anticipation that commanded attention. After speaking, instead of filling nervous silence with clarification or backtracking, he would simply wait, allowing his words to land with their full weight. 6 months into his experiment, Alexander received an unexpected promotion. His manager explained the decision in terms that would have made Nietzsche smile. "You've become someone people listen to, not just hear." The transformation was complete. From a man once desperate for validation through words, he had become someone whose silence spoke volumes. The most revealing moment of Alexander's philosophical journey came during an executive retreat at a rustic mountain lodge. 20 senior staff members gathered around a massive oak table, discussing the company's 5-year strategy. As the hours passed, Alexander noticed something fascinating happening. The traditional office hierarchy was dissolving, revealing what Nietzsche would call the will to power in its rawest form. Davis, the marketing director with the corner office and impressive title, gradually lost his dominance as his verbose explanations revealed underlying insecurities. Meanwhile, Blair from operations, typically overlooked in day-to-day operations, commanded growing attention with her economical, precisely timed insights. Alexander recognized what was happening through a Nietzschean lens. Under pressure, the masks of social convention were slipping, revealing each person's true relationship with power. When his turn came to speak about his department's role in the company's future, Alexander stood silently for 17 seconds before beginning. He had calculated this pause precisely, long enough to create tension, not so long as to seem affected. The room grew completely still. Even the usually distracted CFO set down his phone. This was not merely a presentation technique, it was a physical demonstration of Nietzsche's concept of power as self-control. "Most of what needs to be said has been covered," Alexander began, his voice low and measured. "I'll address only what's been missed." Rather than repeating points to claim ownership or adding unnecessary details to appear thorough, he identified 3 critical gaps in the discussion. His entire contribution lasted less than 2 minutes. When he finished, no one spoke for several seconds. They were adopting his silence, unconsciously mirroring his power. The CEO later pulled Alexander aside. "Your approach today, it reminded me of something my mentor once told me. The hallmark of wisdom is knowing when to withhold it." What the CEO didn't realize was that he was echoing Nietzsche's view that wisdom isn't about knowing everything, but about recognizing what matters. Back in the city, Alexander's transformation began, affecting his physical presence. His movements became more deliberate, his gestures more minimal. Where he once filled elevator rides with nervous small talk, he now stood comfortably in silence, making brief eye contact with others that acknowledged their presence without demanding engagement. A researcher from Cambridge University discovered that powerful individuals typically move more slowly and occupy more space. Unconsciously, Alexander had adopted these traits. His wardrobe shifted toward darker colors and simpler patterns, black turtlenecks, charcoal suits with minimal detailing. This wasn't conscious image crafting, but a natural extension of his philosophical evolution. As Nietzsche wrote in Twilight of the Idols, the most spiritual human beings, assuming they are the most courageous, also experience by far the most painful tragedies, But it is precisely for this reason that they honor life, because it brings against them its most formidable weapons. The painful tragedy Alexander had experienced was the recognition of how much of his former self had been constructed to please others, a realization both liberating and terrifying. His new external simplicity reflected an internal clarity about who he truly was. During a crucial client presentation that would determine a multi-million-dollar contract, Alexander demonstrated the culmination of his silent power. The client, a notoriously difficult CEO known for interrupting presentations with challenging questions, sat stone-faced as Alexander's team delivered their proposal. When the client began his usual barrage of skeptical inquiries, Alexander's colleagues grew visibly nervous, rushing to provide elaborate justifications. Alexander, however, did something unexpected. When the client directed a particularly pointed question at him about implementation timelines, Alexander simply held his gaze for 3 seconds before responding, "You're right to be concerned. The timeline is ambitious." Then silence. No defensiveness. No over-explanation, no desperate reassurances. The client, accustomed to watching people squirm under his scrutiny, leaned forward with newfound interest. "Finally, someone who doesn't try to sell me fairy tales." Continue. What Alexander understood, and what Nietzsche articulated, was that power doesn't come from proving yourself to others, but from being so secure in your own worth that external validation becomes unnecessary. The client sensed this self-assurance and was drawn to it, a manifestation of what Nietzsche called star friendship, a connection based on mutual recognition of strength rather than neediness. The contract was secured. At the celebration dinner, afterward, as champagne flowed and his colleagues reveled in their success, Alexander sat quietly observing. His department head raised a toast. To Alexander, who somehow says more by speaking less than any of us. The irony wasn't lost on him. His silence had become his most distinctive voice. At home that night, Alexander stood by his window overlooking the city lights. He recalled a line from Nietzsche's "Thus spoke Zarathustra" that had once seemed impenetrable, but now felt like the simplest truth. The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. His journey into strategic silence had been exactly this, learning to soar while others remained tethered to their need for constant verbal validation. He pulled out his journal and wrote a single line. "True power lies not in making others hear you, but in making them listen when you finally choose to speak." The next morning, he would return to the office, carrying this silence like an invisible shield, not as a tactic or strategy anymore, but as the natural expression of his authentic self. As Alexander's mastery of strategic silence transformed him from an overlooked team member into a magnetic presence that commanded respect without demanding it, a final test awaited him, one that would challenge everything he had learned about Nietzsche's philosophy of power. 6 months after his promotion, the company announced a merger with their largest competitor. Rumors of massive layoffs spread through every department. In the midst of this chaos, Alexander received an unexpected email from the company's founder, a legendary figure who had built the business from nothing but rarely involved himself in day-to-day operations anymore. "I've been watching you," the message read. "Meet me tomorrow, 7 a.m. No preparation necessary." That night, Alexander barely slept. For all his newfound confidence, this summoning stirred something primal within him. Had his unorthodox approach finally backfired, or was something else entirely at play? The next morning, he found himself in a sparse office on the top floor, face to face with the founder, a man whose reputation for brilliant strategic thinking was matched only by his ruthlessness in business. For nearly 5 minutes, the older man said nothing, just studied Alexander with penetrating eyes. Two masters of silence locked in an unspoken battle of wills. What happened next would not only determine Alexander's future, but would reveal the ultimate truth about Nietzsche's most misunderstood teaching, that the greatest power isn't found in dominating others, but in a profound realization that few ever truly grasp. A revelation so contrary to our cultural programming that it transforms not just how you communicate, but how you move through the world itself. In our next segment, I'll reveal the founder's shocking proposal to Alexander, the hidden test embedded within their silent encounter, and the three-word response that would ultimately catapult him beyond even Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch. You'll discover the final evolution of strategic silence, beyond manipulation, beyond advantage, to what the philosopher called the greatest weight, and why understanding this is the key to outsmarting anyone without saying a word. Stay with me to learn the technique Alexander used that morning, a method you can apply immediately in your own life to command any room and manipulation attempts before they begin, and access a level of personal power that 99% of people will never experience.